Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're talking about Civil War. But before we get into that, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. We've got a great community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. With all that said, let's dive in. So, in classic Marvel comics, they have a thing called the Mutant Registration Act, which was an analog for the real world concern that history might repeat itself. So, specifically, you'd have a character like Magneto who had lived through the atrocities that took place in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, and he would see the humans propose the Mutant Registration Act. And his fear would be that history was going to repeat itself and that soon it would be the mutants who would find themselves in camps. And later we would get stories like Days of Future Past where we saw mutants in camps. So the worry was justified. And as a friendly reminder, many of the creators at Marvel Comics back in the day were Jewish men. So when they're expressing their concerns through their art, I think that's really important to keep in mind. So when the Civil War comics came along and co-opted the terminology of Registration Act, I think that confused the issue and muddied the waters. I think it was a bad move. The writers of Civil War expanded it from just being about the mutants to now being about all superheroes. But now it wasn't about history repeating itself. It was about how the writers felt about the Bush administration and some of the choices the Bush administration made in the days following September 11th of 2001. But it wasn't just about that either, because it was also an analog for gun control and the idea of banning firearms. But here's the problem with that. For the most part, at that point in time, the people who wanted to ban firearms tended to be left leaning, while those who supported Bush tended to be right leaning. So if you see young superheroes like Namorita cause a bunch of collateral damage, and you say they need to register with the government and be trained, then on the one hand, you are saying that the people who are forcing that on the supers are basically Bush era Republicans. But then, since this is also about gun control, you're saying that the people who want to do the banning, whether it's guns or supers, are Democrats. So then the bad guys in the comics are like the Schrodinger's cat of politics, right? They are simultaneously vilified for being Democrats and Republicans at the same time, right? So it's a contradiction of terms. Sometimes when we talk about a story, we say it was a good idea that was poorly executed. But in the case of Civil War, I don't even think it was a good idea. I think it was a bad idea from day one. Then, on top of that, the writer would take characters he liked and would say they were on this side. And because he wanted to see them fight so and so because of their powers and their abilities, then he'd force that second character to be on the opposing team, even if that went against how the character had always been portrayed in the comics, which was one of 100 reasons why I was no longer reading comic books by the time this was published. I picked it up years after the fact at my local Ollie's for $2 or $3, and it was not my thing. And not just Civil War. I hated House of M, Avengers Disassembled, and pretty much everything else that was happening in the comics back then. Now, mind you, if you like it, that's great. More power to you, really. I'm never telling you what you should or should not like. What I'm doing is establishing that I didn't like it, and as a result, I did not feel particularly compelled to follow this storyline in my role playing game. So, Speaking of the role-playing game, I'll do a quick recap because I've discovered that while there is a small core group of you who listen to every single video I make, and thank you for that, by the way, you guys are awesome. There are a great many videos that I do where the majority of people who hear that one have never heard my podcast before. Thus, the reason I do these recaps. So that said, the quick recap would be that we ran a game set on September 11th of 2001 where what happened in the real world happened in the game world. And as a result, the Bush administration then sent a man named John Redbridge to the Middle East to take out the bad guys. And he did. That, by the way, was inspired by that bit in Watchmen where they send Dr. Manhattan to Vietnam. And as a result, he wins the war. So we did the exact same thing. Redbridge takes care of things real quick because he has phenomenal cosmic power. But then we were left with the question of what came next. Just like in the real world, if you pull out of the region, then typically you risk the chances that more bad guys just fill that power vacuum. And now you have the same problem that you began with. So we decided John Redbridge would become the king of Qurac. And to us, that made sense because when he arrived on Earth around 6000 BC, the primitive screwheads that he encountered couldn't fathom what an alien was or even a planet. So they thought he was a god and they called him Dagda. And for a while, he was the king of Ireland. And they loved him, by the way. Dagda was famous for being a ladies' man and having tons of girlfriends, and he was the life of the party. And he was always hanging out at D&D style taverns, buying a round of drinks for everybody, so on and so forth, right? They loved him. And we borrowed a page from the first Highlander movie, where then the character lives through the ages, never getting old and constantly going by different names. So just as the Highlander had gone by Connor MacLeod of the Clan MacLeod, and then later he was Russell Nash, Dagda ended up in Camelot, where they called him Arthur, which, by the way, means bear. And the Morrigan from Celtic mythology was then called Morgan Le Fay. And to the Geats, he was Beowulf, which means Beowulf, which in turn means bear. And in the days of Shakespeare, he was Oberon, which is French for bear. And Morrigan was Titania. And as was the case before, they're king and a queen over and over again. So through the ages, we see the repetition of the theme of him going to a place and taking over. And in the context of a fantasy genre, this was seen as a good thing. So then we did it in the 21st century in the Middle East. We said he was the king of Qurac, and he had this harem of girls akin to what we might see in something like 1001 Arabian Nights. But in the 21st century, people lost their minds over this and were quick to call him a villain in the black and white moral sense. And as a brief aside, let me just say something. Have you ever seen an old action movie where the bad guys kill the hero's girlfriend or wife or daughter or whatever? So the good guy kills all the bad guys one by one, saving the main bad guy for last, and then he typically throws them off of a building or something like that, right? I hate that. I've always hated that. To me, that's just entirely too simplistic. It always reminded me of certain classes I had in school where they taught the lesson for the dumbest kid in class, and then the other 99% hated it. I feel like that's how a lot of our entertainment is. Very cookie cutter, very unimaginative, and not something that forces us to do very much thinking. Anyway, so I hate those kinds of stories, and that's not how I want to run my games. I like it when something is nuanced or complex. So, with this whole King of Qurac thing, I decided to explore the idea of a benevolent dictatorship. When I was in college, I had various classes, whether they were philosophy or psychology, where the idea of the benevolent dictator would come up. And it often prompted an interesting discussion. So I wanted that in my game. So on the one hand, John Redbridge was doing some bad stuff. And we'd mentioned the Lochnar had been a bad influence on him. His eyes were glowing green at the time, for instance. He was doing the harem thing, which a lot of people would agree was morally questionable. But then on the other hand, he was doing good things too. So, for instance, he started using his powers to turn the deserts green, filling them with vegetation, making it rain, etc. And those crops were being used to feed the starving. He'd sub his omnipower for regeneration usable on others, or systemic antidote usable on others to heal the sick and cure diseases. He'd sub omnipower for fabricate to house the homeless. He had supers go out into the ocean and use force manipulation to put a net around that giant island of trash floating there and go throw it in the sun. And people were using super breath to freeze the polar ice caps. As another brief aside, by the way, I saw a Superman comic book not long ago where the new John Kent Superman was standing on a street corner holding a sign about that very thing. And I thought it was so stupid coming from a character who could literally just go use super breath on the polar ice caps and fix the problem in less than a minute. God, I hate today's comic books. At, at any rate, though, getting back to the game, so John Redbridge was doing good things too. During Our Worlds at War, when Imperiex was being a problem, the Alien Alliance, including royalty from various planets, like Maxima, Queen of Almerac. And our boy Dagda here was using his ladies' man abilities, so he starts marrying these various queens and such. And now he's the king of these various planets. And anyways, the players that I had would tend to pick one side of him and focus only on that. So either they loved him for healing the sick and feeding the hungry, etc., or they hated him for having more than one lover, which to me was fascinating because it was usually our more left-leaning players who found themselves opposing a harem, while they simultaneously thought if a girl did the same thing, well, that would be fine. And opposing her would be slut shaming. And if she did it, then, you go, girl, go get you some. Again, I find that contradiction fascinating. And the more right leaning guys who, in real world, favored monogamy seemed okay with John Redbridge. And by the way, one of the things Emperor Redbridge did was because he was a fictional character with a superhuman level of intelligence, he was being very arrogant back then, which again we blamed on the Lochnar. And he thought of humans as stupid and incompetent, and as such, he did not allow voting. I bring this up because the more right leaning players who were the most apt to talk about freedom in real life were supporting a guy who arguably was taking away freedom, certain freedoms at least. Again, how people landed on this whole issue was very, very interesting to me. So that by itself, to me, was worth the price of admission. Anyway, so as you might expect, the heroes of the game world started their own little civil war. But instead of it having anything to do with a registration act or the Sokovia Accords, ours was about whether or not you supported John Redbridge. So they fought. And because they were heroes, nobody ever declared killing combat. It was always knockout damage. So what we ended up with was a series of skirmishes and conflicts that seemed like they were never going to end. So Redbridge decided to give a speech and explain his point of view. And to understand this speech, I need to mention the spy skill from first edition DC Heroes, and specifically how it has a sub skill called brainwashing. Now, before I go further, I found that a lot of the guys online who dabble in DC Heroes tend to misunderstand the system quite a bit. I had a conversation on Facebook recently with a guy who thought the names of the powers had to be literal. But that is not how DC works. Automobiles, for instance, have the running power, but they don't have legs. There is no power called wheels. So the system uses one thing to represent another. And the more you study DC heroes, the more examples of this you are likely to encounter. That is often why they have bonuses and limitations on the character sheet. My point is that just because the skill is called brainwashing, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be literal. The way we were doing it, it represented a motivational speech designed to win over hearts and minds. So John Redbridge goes to some TV studio and they make a recording of him using the brainwashing skill to give a speech where he tries to get the viewer to see his side of things. So he does that, and we roll dice, and it's a bad roll. So after he's done, he says, could we try that again? And of course, the film crew who work for him agree, and he tries again. And once more, we roll dice, and it's better than the first time, but he knows he can do better. So they try again. And on take 3, he rolls even lower than he did on take 2. So he asks to do it again. And that's when we get to take 4, which has become notorious in our game world. On take 4, he rolls double 10s, which is a critical success. And for those who are unfamiliar, in DC Heroes, if you roll doubles, you keep that total, then roll again. And whatever you get on the second roll, you add that sum to the first thing that you rolled. And if you roll doubles again, you add that to the existing numbers. And as long as you keep rolling doubles, you keep getting this bigger and bigger number, which is a more and more powerful result in game. So John Redbridge on take 4 rolls doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles until he arrives at this insanely powerful result. He gives this speech where anyone who hears it not only agrees with what he's doing now, but they are like fanatically loyal to his cause. So even someone who hates him can watch the Take 4 broadcast and be like, oh my God, what was I thinking? I was so wrong. And that ended the Civil War. And not only that, it united the world. So at the end of the day, John Redbridge was the supreme ruler of Earth K, the emperor of the new Terran Empire. And that wasn't the only planet he ruled. He still controlled countless other worlds. He married the Empress of the Shi'ar. He married the Empress of the Skrull Empire, on and on. So for this little moment of time, there was peace throughout the universe. And like before, some players loved it and some hated it. And as you might expect, this peace would not last. But that would be a story for another day. I enjoyed this. I hope you did too. If so, as always, smash that like button. Make sure you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you without telling you, and leave us a comment. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero role-playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.